What would you do if you discovered that in the very heart of the Amazon there existed a family that, for generations, had violated all the laws of nature and morality? Deep within the rainforests of Brazil, on the island of Marajo, the locals still speak of the Barbosa sisters only in whispers. These women shared one husband and created a lineage that has become synonymous with horror, buried secrets, and tainted blood. Official documents, hidden diaries, and the testimonies of survivors reveal the truth about what was born behind the damp walls of an old stilt house. One of the most incestuous and terrifying families in history, a lineage marked by ancient pacts, deformities, silence, and rituals that continue to exist even today, hidden among the tributaries of the Amazon. If you're interested in these kinds of historical mysteries, be sure to subscribe to our channel. This is the forbidden story of the Barbosa sisters. Dr. Marcelo Santos never planned to become the keeper of the Amazon's darkest secret. An anthropologist from the University of Sao Paulo, he arrived on Marajo Island in February of 2021 to study the traditional communities of the river dwellers. The humid air clung to his skin, and the sounds of the jungle created a constant symphony of life and death. On the morning of the third day of his expedition, a local guide, João da Silva, led him to an abandoned house on wooden stilts, half swallowed by vegetation. The smell of decay and something else, something more sinister, hung in the air. João refused to approach the structure any closer, only pointing a trembling finger at the dilapidated walls. Santos felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end when he heard a faint humming coming from inside the house. It was a sound he would never forget, a sound that, as he later understood, was the voices of the past trapped in the wood and time. As Santos approached the house, the boards under his feet creaked with each step, as if warning him to turn back. The front door, once painted blue, was now peeling, revealing the dark wood beneath. He pushed the door, and it opened with a drawn-out moan. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, filled with the smell of mold and something Swedish that made his stomach clench. Rays of sunlight pierced through cracks in the walls, creating streaks of light in the darkness. On the floor lay shards of ceramics, scraps of fabric, and what looked like old photographs, darkened by the humidity. But most of all, his attention was drawn to a wooden chest in the corner of the room, covered in strange symbols that he had never seen in his studies of Amazonian cultures. When he tried to lift the lid, it resisted, as if something was trying to keep it closed from the inside. Inside the chest, Santos discovered a collection of documents that would change his understanding of what was possible in the isolated communities of the Amazon. Among the yellowed papers tied with a red ribbon, he found birth certificates dating back to the beginning of the 20th century, all signed with the same name, a priest. But the dates didn't add up. Children born in the same year had the same parents but different combinations of names. More disturbing was that many birth certificates showed the same father for children from multiple women with the same last name, Barbosa. That name was repeated again and again, creating a web of family connections that became increasingly convoluted with each document. Santos felt a chill run down his spine when he understood the pattern. The sisters married one man, their children married each other, and this cycle repeated generation after generation. The most disturbing document was a diary written in a trembling hand in Portuguese, with a mixture of local dialects. The first entry was dated July 19, 1923. The author introduced himself as Father Antonio Mendes, a Catholic priest assigned to a remote mission on Marajo Island. His first entries were ordinary observations about life in the jungle, the difficulties of communicating with the local people, and the challenges of spreading the Christian faith. But by August, the tone of the entries had changed. Mendes wrote about the Barbosa family with growing unease. He described how three sisters, Maria, Rosa, and Carmen, lived with one man named Joaquim in one house. At first, he assumed it was a temporary arrangement due to economic hardship, but when he tried to intervene and separate them, the community rejected him with a hostility that bordered on threat. According to Mendes, the Barbosa family arrangement was not an accident or the result of poverty. It was a deliberate system passed down from generation to generation. The elders of the community explained to him that the Barbosa sisters were keepers of ancient knowledge passed down from their ancestors, who arrived in the Amazon not as colonists but as fugitives from the Inquisition. This knowledge included not only herbal medicine and fertility rituals, but also practices that the Catholic Church considered heresy. The priest recorded that the sisters claimed that their union with one man was necessary to preserve the purity of their magical abilities. They believed that the sharing of blood between the sisters and the concentration of genealogical lines enhanced their powers and ensured the protection of their community from external threats. Mendez documented his attempts to understand the beliefs of the Barbosa family through a series of conversations with Maria, the eldest of the sisters. She told him that their family held secrets passed down by Portuguese New Christians who had fled to the Amazon in the 15th century. These secrets included not only Kabbalistic practices but also knowledge of how to use the isolation of the jungle to preserve and concentrate spiritual power. According to Maria, each generation of the family had to choose between scattering across the world, which would lead to the loss of their abilities, or maintaining the union of blood, which maintained their connection to what she called the ancient forces of the forest. The priest recorded that during these conversations, he often felt the presence of something else in the room, as if invisible figures were listening to their conversation. What worried Mendez most were the physical characteristics of the children of the Barbosa family. In his notes, he described anomalies that became more pronounced with each generation. The children were born with unusually pale skin for the region, almost translucent, through which the veins could be seen. Their eyes had a strange golden hue that seemed to glow in the dark. Many of the children had 6 fingers on their hands or feet, which the family considered a sign of blessing rather than deformity. But more disturbing were the mental characteristics. The children demonstrated supernatural intuition, the ability to predict the weather and the behavior of animals, and, most disturbingly, the ability to know things that they could not know through ordinary means. Mendez recorded an incident in which a 5-year-old child accurately described the death of a person in a neighboring village, hours before the news reached their community. The priest's diary contained detailed descriptions of the rituals that the Barbosa family performed during certain lunar cycles. These ceremonies took place deep in the forest, in a place they called the Circle of Ancestors. Mendez secretly followed them one night and recorded what he saw. The sisters and their children formed concentric circles around an ancient tree, the roots of which formed natural steps. They sang in a language that the priest could not identify, but which seemed to him a mixture of Portuguese, local dialects, and something much older. During the ritual, they sacrificed small animals but did not eat them. Instead, the animal's blood was mixed with water from a special spring and drunk by all participants. Mendez recorded that, after drinking this mixture, the children began to exhibit behavior that he could only describe as a state of trance or possession. The most disturbing entry in the diary, dated October 12, 1924, described an incident that made Mendez understand the true nature of what he was facing. During one of his visits to the family, he discovered that one of the younger sisters, Carmen, was pregnant. When he asked about the father of the child, the answer he received made his blood run cold. The child was from her own son from a previous pregnancy, a boy who was only 14 years old. When the priest expressed his horror and tried to explain the sin of incest, the family reacted not with shame but with anger. They explained that it was not a crime, but a necessity to preserve the purity of their line. The eldest sister, Maria, told him that the outside world could not understand their sacrifices to maintain the balance between the visible and invisible worlds. What they discovered next was not in any official report. Santos continued to read Mendez's diary, and the entries became increasingly disjointed and desperate. The priest began to document strange events that he could not explain rationally. He wrote about how animals avoided the Barbosa family's house, how plants around their property grew in unnatural shapes, and how even the air in the area seemed denser and more difficult to breathe. More disturbing was his observation that the children of the family did not seem to age at a normal rate. A boy whom he had first met as an infant, after 3 years looked not like a 3-year-old child, but like someone much older, with eyes that contained knowledge inappropriate for his age. Mendez began to suspect that the family's practices were not merely social or religious deviations, but something that was changing the very nature of humanity. The last entries in the diary were barely legible, written in the trembling hand of a person in a state of extreme stress. Mendez described visions that began to visit him after months of contact with the Barbosa family. He saw figures in his dreams, people with deformed faces and burning eyes, who spoke to him in voices that echoed from the depths of the ages. These figures showed him images of the future, of generations of the Barbosa family continuing their practices, spreading through the jungle like a cancer of spiritual corruption. In his penultimate entry, the priest wrote that he had understood a terrible truth. The family was not simply preserving its abilities through incest. They were creating something new, a hybrid of human and something else, something that should never have existed in this world. The final entry in the diary consisted of a single line, written in large, trembling letters, "They are coming for me." After that, the pages of the diary were empty, except for dark stains that Santos preferred not to analyze too closely. Official records of the Catholic Church showed that Father Antonio Mendez disappeared in November of 1924. His body was never found, and the church officially declared his death the result of an accident in the jungle. But the locals told a different story. They said that the priest was last seen walking towards the Barbosa family's house at sunset and that same night, screams echoed from the depths of the forest until dawn. Santos spent the next 2 weeks in the archives of the municipality of Belém, trying to find additional information about the Barbosa family. What he discovered only deepened the mystery and increased his concern. Official records showed that the family continued to register births and deaths throughout the 20th century, but with increasing anomalies. Many birth certificates showed children born to parents who, according to other documents, were siblings. The death certificates were even more disturbing. Members of the Barbosa family seemed to live extraordinarily long lives for a region where the average lifespan was significantly lower than the national average. Some records showed people living over 100 years, which was virtually impossible given the harsh living conditions in the Amazon at the time. But no one dared to say it out loud. The archival records also contained strange omissions and inconsistencies. Periods of several years when no records of the Barbosa family were made, and then sudden bursts of registrations of births and deaths. Santos noticed that these omissions coincided with periods of social unrest in the region, wars with indigenous tribes, economic crises, or natural disasters. It was as if the family had a supernatural ability to disappear in difficult times and reappear when the danger had passed. The archivist, an elderly man named Carlos Medeiros, who had worked in the archives for over 30 years, told Santos that there was an unwritten rule among the staff not to discuss the records of the Barbosa family. He said that previous researchers who had shown too much interest in that family usually either abandoned their research without explanation or disappeared from the region. Medeiros told Santos a story he had heard from his grandfather, who worked in the archives in the 1950s. According to that story, in 1947, a group of anthropologists from the University of Rio de Janeiro came to study the isolated communities of the Amazon. They spent several months in the region and collected extensive documentation on various families and their customs. But when they reached the Barbosa family, something changed. The leader of the expedition, Dr. Ricardo Almeida, who was known for his rationality and skepticism, began to show signs of extreme stress. His colleagues reported that he had stopped sleeping, constantly made notes in a notebook that he showed to no one, and spoke of the need to warn the world about something terrible that he had discovered. Almeida's expedition ended in tragedy, which was officially declared an accident, but the locals knew better. According to the official version, Dr. Almeida drowned in the river during a night walk. His body was swept away by the current and never found. But the river dwellers told a different story. They said they saw Almeida that night, not by the river, but walking towards the Barbosa family's house, carrying kerosene lamps and something that looked like a firearm. They heard screams and sounds of struggle, and then a strange silence that lasted until dawn. When the sun rose, the Barbosa family's house looked untouched, but Almeida had disappeared, and his team left the region that same day, refusing to discuss what had happened. That case was only the beginning. Santos found records of similar incidents occurring every few years throughout the 20th century. Researchers, journalists, government inspectors, and even military patrols disappeared after contact with the Barbosa family. In 1972, A team from the National Indian Foundation came to investigate reports of human rights violations in isolated communities. Their leader, Maria Silva Costa, was an experienced social worker who had spent years working with marginalized communities throughout Brazil. Her last report, dated August 18, 1972, described her initial observations of the Barbosa family. She wrote about the physical anomalies she observed in the children and about what she called an atmosphere of overwhelming fear that surrounded everyone who lived near the family. Costa documented her attempts to interview members of the Barbosa family, but her notes showed growing frustration and anxiety. She wrote that the family answered her questions, but their answers seemed to contain hidden meanings that she could not decipher. The children especially worried her. She described how they looked at her with an expression that was too adult for their years, as if they knew something about her that she herself did not know. In her last entry, dated August 22nd, she wrote that she planned to spend one last night in the region to observe the family during one of their night ceremonies. She never returned from that expedition. Her body was found 3 days later in the river, but the forensic expert noted strange wounds on her body that did not match drowning. However, there was something even more disturbing. Santos discovered that the Barbosa family did not limit its practices to its original home on Marajo Island. As the generations passed, members of the family began to migrate to other parts of the Amazon, always settling in remote areas where government control was minimal. Each new community they founded soon began to exhibit the same characteristics, the same pattern of incest, the same physical and mental anomalies among the children, and the same rituals observed in the original family. By the end of the 20th century, Santos found evidence of the existence of at least 7 different communities throughout the Brazilian Amazon that had connections to the original Barbosa sisters. But what they found next changed everything. Deep within the archives, Santos discovered a folder labeled as classified by the Brazilian government in the 1980s. The documents in this folder were part of a secret study conducted by military intelligence during the military dictatorship. The project was codenamed Operation Green Hell, and was aimed at mapping and monitoring what the government considered potentially subversive elements in the Amazon. Among those elements, the Barbosa family occupied a special place, not because of the political threat they posed, but because of something much more disturbing. The military researchers documented not only the genealogy of the Barbosa family, but also what they called anomalous biological characteristics that became more pronounced with each generation. Dr. Enrique Vargas, a military biologist who led the study, wrote in his reports that the Barbosa family represented what he could only describe as an evolutionary deviation. The children born from incestuous unions not only survived, but thrived, demonstrating physical and mental abilities that went far beyond the normal human range. Vargas wrote that this contradicted all known principles of genetics, where incest usually led to weakness and disease, not to improvement. The most disturbing were the medical tests that the military conducted on some members of the Barbosa family, whom they were able to study without their knowledge. Blood tests showed genetic markers that did not match any known human population. The DNA contained sequences that seemed to have been artificially altered or crossed with something that scientists could not identify. Dr. Vargas wrote in one of his last reports that he was beginning to suspect that the Barbosa family was the result not just of incest, but of some type of genetic experiment that had begun generations ago and continued to this day. The military study was abruptly terminated in 1984 after a series of incidents that the government preferred to classify. According to the documents that Santos was able to find, several military researchers working on the project began to show signs of what was officially described as nervous breakdowns. They reported nightmares, paranoia, and visions that interfered with their ability to function. Dr. Vargas disappeared in October of 1984 during what should have been a routine trip to collect data. His colleagues found his research notes burned, and the only thing left was a note, written in his handwriting, which read, "They are not human," up until one detail no one dared to mention. Records showed that, in the final years of their study, the military began to lose control of the situation. The Barbosa families, who had initially avoided contact with the outside world, began to actively spread beyond their traditional territories. New communities were appearing in areas where no one had been before, and these communities were demonstrating more aggressive behavior towards outsiders. Military documents described incidents where researchers or government agents who came too close to these new communities were found dead under circumstances that could not be explained as accidents or attacks by wild animals. One of the most disturbing documents was the report of Major Carlos Ferreira, commander of a military base in Manaus, in 1983. He received orders to investigate reports of strange activity in a remote area along the Solimões River. Locals reported a new community that had appeared overnight. Literally. Ferreira led a patrol of 12 soldiers to investigate. What they found changed his understanding of what was possible. The community consisted of structures that seemed to have been built with impossible speed and precision. The houses were perfectly adapted to the surrounding environment, as if they had grown out of the earth itself rather than being built by human hands. Ferreira wrote in his report that the inhabitants of this new community all had the characteristic features of the Barbosa family: pale skin, golden eyes, and extra fingers. But what struck him most was that all the inhabitants, from the youngest to the oldest, moved with the same grace and coordination, as if they were parts of a single organism. When his patrol approached, the inhabitants showed no fear or curiosity, which would have been expected from an isolated community upon meeting armed soldiers. Instead, they simply stopped what they were doing and looked at the soldiers with an expression that the major could only describe as anticipation. The most disturbing moment was when one of the soldiers, Private Jose Alves, separated from the group to explore what looked like a vegetable garden behind one of the houses. Ferreira noticed that the plants in this garden grew in geometric patterns that were too perfect to be random. The roots formed spirals, the leaves grew in mathematically precise proportions, and the fruits had colors that were not found in nature. When Alves tried to touch one of the plants, all the inhabitants of the community simultaneously turned their heads towards him. The major described that moment as one of the most terrifying of his military career. There was no sound, no visible signal, but every resident of the community, including infants, simultaneously focused their attention on the soldier with a precision that was inhuman. Ferreira's patrol left the community that same day, but the incident did not end there. Over the following weeks, Private Alves began to exhibit strange behavior. He complained of dreams where he saw the faces of the community's residents, but those faces were slowly transforming into something else, something with overly sharp teeth and eyes that burned like embers. Alves also began to demonstrate physical changes. His skin became paler, his eyes took on a golden hue, and he began to exhibit knowledge of things that he could not know, such as the exact time of death of fellow servicemen who were healthy. 2 months after the visit to the community, Alves disappeared from the military base. His body was found a week later in the river, but the forensic expert noted that there were extra fingers on his body that had not been there before. Operation Green Hell was officially terminated after the disappearance of Dr. Vargas, but unofficial activity continued. Santos discovered records that the Brazilian government continued to monitor the Barbosa families, but with a changed strategy. Instead of direct research, they adopted a policy of containment. Military patrols regularly flew over the areas where Barbosa communities were known to exist, but strict orders prohibited any land contacts. The goal was simple: to ensure that the families did not expand beyond certain geographical boundaries, and to warn the outside world of any signs that they were trying to integrate into ordinary society. But there was one detail that the government could not hide. During the 1990s and 2000s, sporadic reports appeared of people in cities throughout the Amazon who demonstrated characteristics similar to the Barbosa family. These people usually appeared in hospitals or clinics with diseases that doctors could not diagnose. They had pale skin, golden eyes, extra fingers, and blood tests showed genetic anomalies that did not match any known human population. What was even more disturbing, these people always disappeared from medical facilities before complete tests could be performed. Dr. Ana Rodriguez, a hematologist from a hospital in Belém, documented several such cases between 1998 and 2003. She wrote in her private notes that patients with Barbosa characteristics demonstrated not only physical anomalies but also behavioral traits that made the medical staff feel uneasy. They rarely spoke, but when they did, their voices had a quality that Dr. Rodriguez described as an echo, as if there were other voices behind their words. They also demonstrated supernatural knowledge of hospital procedures and personal information about the staff that they couldn't know through ordinary means. One of the most disturbing cases that Dr. Rodriguez documented involved a young man who appeared at the hospital in March of 2001. He was estimated to be around 20 years old, but his medical chart indicated that his biological age was closer to 40. He had all the characteristic features of the Barbosa family, but in a more pronounced form. His skin was so pale that it was almost translucent. His golden eyes glowed in the dark, and he had 7 fingers on each hand and foot. But the most alarming thing was his behavior. He didn't respond to questions in Portuguese, but when one of the doctors accidentally spoke in Latin, the patient immediately replied in the same language with perfect grammar and pronunciation. The patient spent only one night in the hospital, but that night was enough to create memories that haunted the medical staff for years. Nurses reported that he didn't sleep all night, but simply lay in bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. When they passed by his room, they heard a sound that they could only describe as singing, but in a language that no one could identify. More disturbing was that other patients in the same ward began to exhibit strange behavior. They complained of nightmares in which they saw figures in white coats who were not medical personnel, and of the feeling of being watched, even when they were alone. In the morning, the patient had vanished. The hospital guards hadn't seen him leave. Security cameras hadn't recorded his movement, and his hospital clothes were found neatly folded on the bed. The only trace of his presence was a smell that Dr. Rodriguez described as a mixture of earth, rotting leaves, and something metallic. This smell remained in the ward for several days, despite attempts at ventilation and disinfection. Even more unsettling, some nurses reported that they continued to hear the singing even after the patient's disappearance, especially late at night when the hospital was quiet, until one part of the puzzle revealed the incomprehensible. Santos decided to return to the original home of the Barbosa family on Marajo Island to conduct a more thorough investigation. This time, he brought a team with him, including an archaeologist, Dr. Lucia Carvalho, and a biologist, Dr. Marcos Santos. Their goal was simple: to conduct a scientific analysis of the site and try to find physical evidence of what was described in the historical documents. What they found exceeded their darkest expectations. Under the house, on its pilings, the team discovered a system of underground chambers that seemed to have been dug with impossible precision. The walls of these chambers were covered with symbols that Dr. Carvalho couldn't identify with any known writing system. The symbols seemed to have been carved not with tools, but with something sharper and more precise, possibly claws or teeth. In the center of the largest chamber was a stone altar covered with dark stains, which laboratory tests later identified as a mixture of human and animal blood, some samples of which were hundreds of years old. But the most disturbing discovery was in the deepest chamber. There, the team found what could only be described as a family tree carved into the stone wall. But this was no ordinary family tree. The names and dates carved in stone showed a lineage that went back not centuries, but millennia. According to these records, the Barbosa family was not of Portuguese origin, as historical documents had suggested. Instead, their line traced back to pre-Columbian civilizations and even further, to periods that predated any known human settlement in the Americas. Dr. Carvalho conducted carbon dating analysis of the stone carvings and obtained results that defied everything that was known about the history of human civilization in the Americas. The oldest symbols dated back approximately 8,000 years, which was a millennium earlier than any known complex societies in the region. More disturbing was that the style of carving and the symbols used showed a level of sophistication that didn't correspond to what archaeologists knew about the capabilities of the ancient peoples of the Amazon. The symbols demonstrated an understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and, most alarmingly, genetics that shouldn't have been possible in that historical period. In one of the side chambers, the team made a discovery that forced them to reconsider the nature of what they were dealing with. They found preserved specimens of what they initially took to be mummified remains of ancient inhabitants. But when Dr. Santos conducted a preliminary biological analysis, he discovered that these remains were not entirely human. The skeletal structure showed adaptations that were not found in any known human population. The skulls were elongated, with additional cavities that suggested a more complex nervous system. The bones of the arms and legs showed additional joints and fingers, and the dental structure included canines that were longer and sharper than those of ordinary humans. But what most struck Dr. Santos was not the physical structure of the remains, but their state of preservation. Despite their estimated age of thousands of years, the tissues were in a condition that more closely matched the remains of individuals who had died only decades ago. Even more disturbing was that, when he tried to take samples for further analysis, the tissues showed signs that they were not completely dead. Under the microscope, the cells exhibited slow but definite activity, as if the organisms were not in a state of death, but in some form of suspended animation. The team spent 3 days in the underground chambers documenting and analyzing what they found. On the 4th day, an event occurred that caused them to immediately leave the site. Dr. Carvalho was working in the deepest chamber taking new photographs of the symbols on the walls when she noticed that the symbols seemed to have changed. The carvings she had photographed the day before now showed additional details that hadn't been there before. When she compared the new photographs with the old ones, the differences were undeniable. The symbols hadn't simply changed. They had evolved, adding new elements that seemed to tell the continuation of the story that was recorded in the stone. More disturbingly, the new symbols seemed to refer to the team's presence. Dr. Carvalho could identify stylized images of 3 figures entering the chambers and what looked like a prediction of what would happen to them next. The images showed the figures slowly transforming, acquiring characteristics similar to the ancient remains they had found. The most horrifying thing was a symbol at the end of the sequence, which seemed to show the 3 figures leaving the chambers, but not as humans, as something else, something with elongated skulls and additional limbs. The team left the underground chambers that same day, but the damage had already been done. Over the following weeks, all 3 members of the team began to exhibit physical and psychological changes that mirrored what had been predicted in the symbols. Dr. Carvalho was the first to notice the changes. Her skin began to pale, her eyes took on a golden hue, and she began to experience severe headaches that seemed to be related to the growth of her skull. Even more alarming were the mental changes. She began to see and hear things that others couldn't perceive, and she demonstrated knowledge of languages that she had never studied. Dr. Marcos Santos exhibited similar symptoms, but in his case, the physical changes were more dramatic. Additional fingers began to develop on his hands and feet, his teeth became sharper, and he began to demonstrate strength that surpassed normal human capabilities. But the most disturbing thing was the change in his behavior. He began to avoid sunlight, preferring to work at night, and his diet changed to exclusively raw meat, which he preferred as fresh as possible. Santos, the leader of the expedition, tried to document the changes happening to his team and himself, but soon realized that he was losing objectivity. His own changes were more subtle, but no less disturbing. He began to see connections between events that others considered random and demonstrated an ability to predict the behavior of people and animals with an accuracy that was uncanny. Even more unsettling, he began to hear voices that seemed to emanate from the Amazon itself. Voices that spoke in a language that he understood but had never studied. The voices told him a story that was far more ancient and horrifying than anything he could have imagined. According to what he heard, the Barbosa family was not a human family that practiced incest, but something far older and more alien that took on human form for survival. They were the remnants of a civilization that predated humanity, beings that had adapted to a changing world by interbreeding with humans and slowly transforming them into something that was a hybrid of the 2 species. Their goal was simple: survival and the gradual recolonization of a planet that had once been theirs. The voices explained that the rituals of the Barbosa family were not primitive religious ceremonies, but complex genetic procedures that used a combination of biology and what humans would call magic to guide the evolution of their descendants. Each generation was a step closer to restoring their original form, and each contact with the outside world was an opportunity to spread their influence. The researchers who disappeared after contact with the Barbosa family were not killed. They were transformed and integrated into a growing network of hybrids that were slowly spreading throughout the Amazon. Santos tried to record what he was hearing, but soon realized that his capacity for critical thinking had been compromised. What he once would have considered absurd superstitions now seemed to him to be undeniable facts. He began to see evidence of the ancient civilization everywhere in the Amazon. in the structure of plant growth, in the behavior of animals, in the patterns of rivers, and even in geological formations. Everything pointed to an intelligence that was far older and more complex than human civilization, an intelligence that had never completely disappeared, but was waiting for the right moment to return. The last entry in Santos's diary is dated August 6, 2021. In it, he wrote that he had understood the true nature of his mission. He was no longer a researcher studying the Barbosa family. He was one of the chosen, selected to serve as a bridge between the old world and the new. His transformation was not a curse, but a blessing, an opportunity to become part of something larger and more significant than human civilization. In his final lines, he wrote that he understood why all the previous researchers had disappeared. They had not been killed or abducted. They had been freed from the limitations of human existence and invited to join a family that extended beyond blood and included all who were willing to accept the transformation. Santos, Dr. Carvalho, and Dr. Santos disappeared on August 7, 2021. Their research equipment was found neatly packed at the entrance to the underground chambers, but of the researchers themselves, there was no trace. Local authorities conducted a search that lasted 2 weeks, but found nothing other than their equipment and diaries. The official version declared their disappearance the result of an accident in the jungle, possibly an attack by wild animals or drowning in one of the region's numerous rivers. But local residents tell a different story. They say that in the nights following the researchers' disappearance, voices could be heard echoing from the depths of the forest, voices that sang in a language that no one could understand, but which was somehow familiar. They also report strange lights moving between the trees and that animals avoid the area around the old home of the Barbosa family with even greater fear than before. More disturbing are the reports of new communities appearing in remote areas of the Amazon, communities whose residents have characteristics that are becoming increasingly familiar. Pale skin, golden eyes, extra fingers, and behavior that is too coordinated to be natural. These new communities do not interact with the outside world, but their presence is felt in changes to the local ecosystem. Plants grow in unnatural patterns, rivers change their courses for no apparent reason, and even the air in these areas seems denser and more difficult to breathe. The Brazilian government continues to monitor the situation, but their strategy has shifted from trying to understand to trying to contain. New military bases have been built at strategic points around the Amazon, officially to protect against illegal mining and deforestation, but unofficially to monitor and prevent the spread of what internal documents call a biological anomaly. Soldiers stationed at these bases are given strict orders: avoid contact with isolated communities and immediately report any signs of people with the characteristics of the Barbosa family. But containment is becoming increasingly difficult. In recent years, there have been reports of people with Barbosa characteristics in cities throughout South America, not only in Brazil but also in Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. These people usually appear in hospitals or clinics, seeking medical attention for conditions that doctors cannot diagnose, and then disappear before full tests can be carried out. But their brief presence leaves traces. Medical personnel report nightmares and visions. Equipment malfunctions for no apparent reason, and other patients begin to exhibit symptoms that resemble the early stages of transformation. Today, the old home of the Barbosa family on Marajo Island remains abandoned, but not empty. Local residents report activity in the area, especially on nights of the new moon, when the sounds of ceremonies can be heard and lights can be seen coming from the underground chambers. Government satellites show anomalies in the area: vegetation that grows in geometric patterns, thermal signatures that don't match any known forms of life, and electromagnetic anomalies that interfere with navigation systems. Even more disturbing is that analysis of satellite images over the past decades shows a slow but steady spread of these anomalies. Areas that previously showed normal vegetation and wildlife are gradually beginning to exhibit the same geometric patterns and anomalous thermal signatures. If this trend continues, experts predict that a significant portion of the Amazon could be transformed within the next 50 years. The question that remains unanswered is what will happen when this transformation reaches a critical mass. Will it simply be a change in the ecosystem, or will something far more fundamental change in the nature of life on Earth? The Barbosa family has kept its secrets for centuries, slowly working on a project that may be far more ambitious than anyone could have imagined. They are not simply surviving in a changing world. They are actively changing it, transforming it back into something that predated humanity. The story of the Barbosa family does not end with their disappearance, or even with the transformation of those who tried to study them. It is an ongoing story that unfolds in the depths of the Amazon every day. Every researcher who disappears, every city dweller with anomalous characteristics, every satellite image showing new geometric patterns in the forest, is a chapter in this story. And the most unsettling thing is that we may not be the readers of this story, but its characters, slowly and inevitably drawn into a transformation that began generations ago, and which may already be too far advanced to be stopped. Deep in the Amazon, where rivers flow through a forest that remembers times before human memory, the Barbosa family continues its ancient work. They wait, they plan, and they slowly change the world back to what it once was. And perhaps, just perhaps, the next person who enters their humid world of green and shadows will not come out of it the same as they went in.